So under the cash expense reduction, the fact that there's literally 2/3 of the organizations right now are focusing on cost reduction versus 38% pre-pandemic. One of the interesting components of that logic is reducing costs and expenses is always, in my mind, a knee-jerk reaction to an uncomfortable or a surprise situation versus taking a methodical approach and really reshaping your business model or paying attention to those areas that you didn't necessarily have to pay attention to pre-pandemic or firefighting, cost reduction situations. One of those is strategies around price increases. I found that for businesses that just create a focus in this area and actually dedicate a half of an employee or a full employee to understand strategically how they should be focusing on pricing on their products and where the opportunities are to increase prices, yield about a 2% improvement in their gross margin, which, I forget what the exact formula math is, but when you look at the bottom line of increasing your prices and your gross margin by 2%, maintaining your costs at the same rate, the impact of the bottom line is much more significant than reducing your costs by X% greater than the 2% price increase. So, the bottom line on that, from my takeaway, is that it's always not that reducing costs isn't something that should be focused on, because obviously, if you can do both of those two things in tandem, you're way ahead of the game in terms of your profitability. But a lot of organizations, especially those that are dealing with a higher SKU count in the wholesale distribution space, and they can pick and choose and their products that have less price elasticity and less visibility in the marketplace. If you were to raise the price 10 cents or $2 or whatever the kind of that point is where the market wouldn't even notice a price increase or care about a price increase, those are where the opportunities are. And it's a balance of looking at the geography, the product category, how competitive, how commoditized is this product, and how visible is it in the marketplace, as well as what the size of the price is. So if something is $1.30 and you raise it to $1.60, it's going to be less of an impact than if something is $340 and you raise it to $345. So
yeah. So Jeff, just piling on the conversation there, and I think we saw a lot of this when the China trade wars were happening, right? When the tariffs were increasingly high, and shippers, right? So brands and shippers essentially had one of two options, right? Eat the cost of the additional taxes and tariffs, or increase pricing to the consumer. So now put yourself on the consumer side on increasing pricing for the same thing that you buy on a day in, day out perspective. As a consumer, how would that make you feel? And before you answer that question, I do want to say that I agree with you that reducing cost in a time of crisis is a knee-jerk reaction. 100% agree with that. I think any good procurement or sourcing organization should have a long-term roadmap working with their tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and so on suppliers to say, hey, here's my cost of bill of materials based off of over time and the life cycle of this specific SKU, I anticipate this much volume and this much cost down as I essentially hit these thresholds and volumes, right? To essentially have a clear roadmap with your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 supply base to say, this is my cost of BOM strategy. And over time, I want to see the cost of BOM go from this X to Y, right? And this is how we're going to get there. And that needs to be agreed to on the sourcing and procurement side, 100% agree. But I think, yes, having a strategy to increase pricing does make sense. But I guess my question to you, and now allowing you to answer that question around what you as a consumer, how would that make you feel knowing that, oh man, this is like COVID pricing? You know what I mean? Like that mentality of I'm buying the same,
no,
like, I'm buying the same
absolutely.
cup. Before COVID, it was $1. Now it's $1.50. It's the same cup. You know, as a consumer, do you think you would essentially, you know, lose interest in that brand or that product or that company, or would you just be like, you know, I'll pay COVID pricing. I'm not, you know, going to the store anymore.
Yeah, I've got a couple of examples that where I've actually paid more, you know, post-pandemic. And it really depends on a lot of variables. One, what's the price point? You know, what's the, are we talking about an item that's a couple of dollars, or, you know, something that's tens or hundreds of dollars? What's the competition in the marketplace like? How many of those widgets, and what are my choices? And lastly, where I paid more is if I have complete visibility in what I get for that increased price. For example, you know, if I'm shopping for something and there's a lower price, but there is either poor reviews or perhaps a not a guaranteed shipment time frame, I'm willing to pay more for something that has higher reviews, as well as something that I know I can get it within, you know, the next 2 or 3 days, versus, I don't know, it could be a week or two or more, and that's, you know, not clearly promised or visible. So, you know, it's all, you know, situational depending on the product, the competition, the price point, and what the added value is for paying that additional amount.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, right? It depends on the supply demand element of it. Perfect example, bicycles, right? There's a shortage of bicycles at least in Southern California, right? There's a shortage of bicycles. You can't get a bike, you know, no matter how much you want to pay. And then the prices have increased just because of the supply and demand and so on and so forth, right? So completely get that element of it. But, you know, in your fast moving consumer goods, perfect example, toilet paper, right? Your toilet paper, because of, say, supply constraints upstream on the supply side, does that warrant increased pricing on the retail side to the consumer side? I would probably say no, because essentially, in my point of view, you know, there should be cost down already thresholds from a sourcing and procurement perspective already in place to hit specific cost down to essentially warrant you know, any kind of pandemic driven, you know, buying and increased volume, right? So if you've had originally a strategy, you know, before any pandemic or anything goes wrong around, you know, costed BOM management, right? And over a period of time, and what that ideal costed BOM looks like and how do you get there? As demand increases, your costed BOM goes down. And then from there, you can either pass the savings off to the customer or continue to increase your gross margin and bottom line, you know, just organically through that, right? And again, that's all around kind of all strategic sourcing and procurement strategies that you can put in place with your suppliers. You know, but I do agree with you that, you know, only focusing on cost down activities when in the situation of crisis is the wrong, you know, kind of way to go about it. I think any good supply chain organization should always have a strategic cost down strategy, whether you're procuring raw materials and sourcing the bill of materials, and then, you know, completing your own in-house manufacturing, or even if it's a turnkey supply chain where you're just procuring a finished good and from a contract manufacturer and that's it. There should always be a long-term kind of cost down strategy, right, over time. But
as well as there, I think there should always be a part of your organization, whether it's, like I said, a partial head or several people that are constantly looking at the marketplace and the pricing of your products, and you're making that part of your core competency as a brand, as a manufacturer, as a distributor. Your pricing strategy needs to be as important as your operational excellence and your growth strategy. Also kind of my other point or takeaway from this was, there's always a knee-jerk reaction to reduce costs, and a lot of times that incorporates some sort of reduction in forces and a layoff of employees, because obviously they're the highest cost factor in running a business. However, what a lot of businesses don't focus on, I find, is repurposing heads, repurposing individuals, and taking the jobs that they did before and trying to become more automated with those heads that they're going to reduce the business by. So not eliminating the net results of those employees, but automating that, and then taking those individuals and determining if there's a better seat on the bus for them to generate more revenue, and not necessarily in outbound sales, but more along the lines of customer satisfaction and improving the brand awareness and the essentially the net promoter score of the business.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, right? When they say cash is king, obviously this article is geared towards obviously the CPO and the sourcing organization, but there's other ways to drive better cash flow, I guess, other than just kind of squeezing your supply base, right, for everything they've got in a knee-jerk manner, right? And then there's obviously, it's not just also about reducing you're cutting your staff just in half, just because that's probably one of the most biggest expenses. There's other ways you can drive costs down around, limiting, obviously T&E and limiting specific OpEx expenditures and so on and so forth, right? But your point, Jeff, there regarding repurposing value-added team members is important, and that goes into the next segue of that, which is teams matter. Right? And I think I was kind of happy I saw this point in this article, because that's absolutely right. As it says, 2 of the 3 most critical success factors for procurement organizations is to navigate the pandemic revolve around employees, teams, and workforce safety, right? And then making sure that the teams are effectively working and essentially communicating, collaborating to deliver organizational kind of goals and strategies during this time period, right? So I think that's a really key and important element of it. I guess my thought on that is, because now work can now be so distributed, how do you effectively then manage that distributed team, right? With this specific focus in mind, right? How do you drive that focus and say, hey, we're going to give you a better seat on the bus, like Jeff, you said, but now how do you drive that focus to that individual or that team in the distributed work environment, when typically this type of organization is either in the office working together closely or boots on the ground? How do you help them shift that mindset?
So for me, that's a really good question, because I find that it kind of top of mind. It brings to surface some key points relative to the teams and organizational culture of the organization. And it comes down to a standardization of people, processes, and systems, and formalized SOPs. So you have to have that infrastructure in place, as well as you have to have a strategic cross-training methodology, so that in this kind of siloed, decentralized work environment, you're enabling cross-functionality as well as better collaboration. And collaboration is a really key element that needs to be maintained, nourished, and encouraged in a decentralized working framework. And in line with that, with the collaboration, is automation of workflow and making sure that the baton is passed from one individual to the next based on the job duties and what I'm doing that affects somebody else or multiple roles, other roles within the organization. I think that is incredibly important. And then lastly, complete transparency in terms of the workflow automation, making sure that each role within the organization is getting a day's job done in a day's time, and that there aren't this list of piling to-do items because people aren't getting to what they should be getting to, that perhaps with management right there coming into their office day in and day out, or looking over their shoulder, or having that oversight in a building, brick and mortar environment, isn't happening in a distributed employee environment. So clear rules and standardization and SOPs, very good cross training, so that if you have to pivot and repurpose individuals based on workloads and or reduction in forces, or individuals out on medical, you've got your bases covered. And then facilitating collaboration and automating workflow and incorporating transparency across all of those aspects.
Yeah, I think absolutely right. Right. So those are the key areas of how do you drive that effective virtual working environment. And with that, you hit on a pretty big one, right? So automation of workflows, obviously, and then creating that transparency of those workflows, so that way the baton is being passed correctly, right? And the end of that segment here, it really says, kind of Deloitte summarizes that procurement organizations have focused their primary efforts on addressing pressing concerns presented by the pandemic. That to me is contradictory to a lot of the survey itself, right? Because the fighting fires is obviously a thing that you kind of have to do. But again, similar to what that article reads, is surprisingly the data quality and visibility, digitization, analytics were respectively only ranked as number 8th, 9th, and 11th on the most critical success factors to navigate the pandemic. But yet organizations are prioritizing fighting, and addressing specific issues relating to the pandemic. In my mind, I think that's kind of backwards, right? If you had proper data quality, visibility, and digitization that drives analytics and visibility, you wouldn't necessarily have to be fighting the fires. You'd essentially be almost putting out fires before they even start, right? So they wouldn't essentially become fires. So in my mind, I think this piece of it was a little bit off, but that's just maybe how
I think it illustrates how most organizations run, and the reality of that most organizations are kind of built around this reactive versus proactive culture. And I love Stephen Covey's illustration of the four quadrants, what's important versus what's urgent, and how our firefighting is always focused around putting out those fires of what's urgent versus having clear visibility into, you know, the right KPIs, what's being measured, and so that you can kind of see ahead of those fires. And, you know, real-time analytics, I think, is a critical component to this, and looking at the right data, the right KPIs, so that it's relevant, it's real-time, and you can focus on what's important versus what's urgent, because you're heading off those urgent items by preempting them with what's important. Thus, you're being proactive versus reactive.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Organizations are almost wired to firefight, right? And you know, I forgot where I saw this, to be honest. But essentially, you know, I remember my time as an operator. Like, if you fought a fire and you put it out and there wasn't too much damage, you kind of were like, "Hey, good job fighting that fire. Good work. You know, keep up the good work." And now I kind of look back at it, and as you know, as Omnichain, we're trying to help and enabling organizations to be proactive. So my thought is like, hey, I shouldn't be rewarded or you know, or kind of, you know, congratulated for fighting a fire. I should have not had the fire happen in the first place. That essentially is more rewarding, right? So I think you're right, Jeff. Right. So it just shows how
the trick there is the trick there is you know, you never get the gratitude for the fire never starting, because it's not visible to, you know, across the organization that you prevented a fire from happening. But it's absolutely the case, you know, that, you know, you want to almost measure the organization on how many fires you didn't have and congratulate those teams versus the fires that got put out.
Yeah, exactly, right. So, you know, it's a different way of thought and mindset. But again, to your point, Jeff, large and small organizations, anybody in between, are just wired in that way of saying, okay, we got to put fires out, as opposed to saying, okay, what's our fire preventative maintenance, you know, that we're doing this month or this quarter or this year, right? Almost having a fire prevention strategy, as opposed to firefighting strategy.
Leads us to the fourth point, supply chain visibility. You know, I've read a lot about the challenges of lead times and suppliers, not providing the same level of service that they had pre-pandemic. And the common theme seems to be in all of these articles that organizations in the past have traditionally been only focused on their tier one suppliers for the most part, and haven't done a good job of building a queue of tier two suppliers and developing those relationships and understanding what their core competencies, strengths are, and or what your negotiated rate would be in the terms associated with pivoting to another supplier. And, you know, it's a very common topic of discussion, you know, today relative to that dynamic of being able to effectively pivot to a tier two when a lot of organizations don't even have a tier two. So that's a fire that they're actually trying to put out, is that, oh crud, you know, my primary supplier for this component or this ingredient is like, you know, 2 months delayed over what their usual lead time would be. I gotta scramble and find a tier two, and that's the fire that I'm putting out. Is I'm trying to find what the right tier two supplier is, or secondary supplier. And I think it, you know, in my mind, it comes down to so much of the procurement team's work today is focused on their siloed data, they're siloed processes, they're redundant tasks, they're manual entry, and not automation, and not measuring the effectiveness of either their systems, or more importantly, things like scorecarding their suppliers, so that you have clear visibility of where the supplier stands, yesterday as well as today, and looking forward to tomorrow. So, with all of the requirements and day-to-day work being handled in such a manual environment, it doesn't provide those procurement frontline as well as management an opportunity to be more forward-looking and strategic in terms of understanding and balancing and preparing for worst-case scenario, because they're too busy with their, keeping up with their manual tasks at hand.
Yeah, I think a part of that is technology availability, or say maybe a lack of technology or a lack of availability of technology with your suppliers, whether it's a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3, what have you, and maybe just them not, shippers not necessarily having the right mindset of, hey, this is possible to integrate or somehow integrate with your supply base. The other side of it is just prioritization, right, of specific work and tasks and so on and so forth, right? But I think, how the article itself positioned this as increasing supply chain visibility, right? So, essentially saying 90% of organizations rated visibility into their extended supply chain networks as moderate to low. That's pretty bad, right? Like, so that, again, that kind of proves your point around most people are only focusing on their tier 1 supply base, right? Which is good, because if they're supporting your crown jewel or whatever your components are, yes, you should be focusing on them. But again, having visibility to your subsequent partners, your tier 3 or even your upstream supply chain networks outside of your tier 1 suppliers is so important, especially in times when there is a global pandemic, or there is specific, geopolitical issues, right? So, it's a combination in my mind of prioritization within an organization to build strategic relationships with, additional suppliers outside of your tier 1 network. And then number 2, a request to the technical organization to say, hey, we need connectivity into our supply base, no matter what tier they are, to be able to have better visibility, on a day in, day out perspective, as well as have better connectivity and automation of workflows, so that way we're not focused on manually upkeeping with these suppliers. We can digitize a lot of that workflow. And then in turn, by doing that, you would then, as a byproduct, get supply chain visibility. So again, I think this point and then the one prior to it, fighting fires, I think contradict each other within this article. But I do kind of, I do think that there is a tremendous opportunity for organizations to have a kind of a step back and say, who are my suppliers am I really close with? And which suppliers do I need to build better relationships with, right? And essentially having a more, I want to say, diversified supplier visibility strategy, I think is important, because as you look to either consolidate or not consolidate your supply base, this becomes really important.
Absolutely. As well as improving your service levels with your customers, and or maintaining, the service levels you had pre-pandemic. Yeah. And what I found also is that is that a lot of the tier 1 suppliers are located overseas, and businesses haven't done a great job of identifying and building relationships with the domestic suppliers, tier 2 suppliers that are, within our own borders to be able to source those items for given, understanding that, yeah, there may be a higher cost associated with it, but, better to partner with those companies than sacrifice the service levels to your customers.
Yeah, I think there's there's a lot more of that happening, right? There's a lot more shift, I want to say, to nearshore or regional suppliers, whether tier 1, tier 2, or whatever tier you want to call it. I think there's definitely a shift into more nearshore or regional supplier kind of transitioning. I also think there is also diversification of your supply base, kind of really from a geographic perspective, right? So, we all know the trade wars that happened early on in the year between U.S. and China, that forced a lot of organizations to really start rethinking about, how do we diversify our supply base in case, the whole tariff thing goes out of whack or continues to go out of whack. So, let's look at other Southeast Asia countries, right? So you saw a lot of uptick in organizations looking into Vietnam and Cambodia and other areas within the Asia kind of network. And then, with the pandemic, shortly following that, suppliers shut down, right? Specifically out of the China region, or the greater China region, I want to call it. And I think there's something, I think I read a stat where I think 60% or so of supply was constrained for more than, I want to say, 3 or 4 months. The backlog of supply that was constrained out of the greater China region was somewhere around 3 or 4 months backlog, right? So that even further made organizations look at, okay, we definitely need to diversify our geographic supply base, right? So out of not really focusing and concentrating on one general area, we need to expand our network and look at nearshore, onshore, and regional supply base. But that comes at a cost, right? So how do you balance that, right? So how do you balance that? Because in most cases, you want to reduce your cost, but at the same time, you want to deliver customer commitments, right? And keep your customers happy. So it's a tough position to be in, right? In any scenario. But I think having a strategy that allows your supply chain from a origin perspective and sourcing perspective to be nimble and contract and consolidate as and when needed is really important, right? For specific scenarios, you may have a strategy that says, if this specific item or if pricing for this specific type of material go out of whack, automatically revert to nearshore. So you're paying a little bit higher pricing, but you're not constrained on your supply, and vice versa, right? So there needs to be an ability to be able to switch back and forth dynamically, almost in the sense to which kind of suppliers service your product based off of obviously time and material and what that product is.
Absolutely. And this goes back to the topic of being proactive versus reactive, and having automation in place and SOPs and transparency within the organization. And what all of that does when it comes together is it provides you with an opportunity to be proactive and to develop those relationships and plan for the contingencies in the future that may arise. And yeah, you may end up paying more for those through those secondary sources. The costs may be higher. However, if you've done your job right, you've been able to source those appropriately, then you've also spent some time building those relationships and positioning negotiations ahead of time, so that when you are in a position of needing that secondary supplier, that relationship already exists. Maybe that pricing already exists, and they're not going to be like, oh, we'll come in and save the day, but it's going to be a premium. So you've done your homework, you've planned for it, you're executing against it, and it's not going to be as bad of a bite as it would have been if you were in a panic mode.
Right. Exactly. I remember during one of my tenures, one of my past lives, I guess I call it, we would actually do that. We would essentially line up secondary, tertiary suppliers, have them essentially build, prototype, and at least go through the mass production process of having a backup and a backup for a backup, right? To say, hey, you know what, you're going to go build this widget, and we're going to call on you if and when we need to, but you need to be able to essentially, here's a small order for whatever, 10,000 of these widgets, right? Build it. We want to see what it looks like. You can be signed up as one of our qualified suppliers. We're not always going to give you an order, but when we do give you an order, you got to deliver against these specific terms and conditions. And you may get an order once a month, you may get an order once a year, you may get an order once every 2 years, right? But you essentially are responsible.
And you may
for this
become our primary supplier.
Right, and that's the other upside, right? So if you do a good job, you may become a primary supplier, right? So we absolutely used to have, for one widget, it's called a widget, one widget, we used to have 2, 3, 4 different suppliers that we can essentially turn on at any given time to be able to say, okay, either I have too much demand and I need to turn on specific suppliers, or my primary supplier's factory blew up. I don't know, God forbid, right? Something happens. You need to have the ability to be able to turn on a different faucet and a spout of supply at any given time. So that's one of the things that we used to do, and I think it's normal practice, right? For especially large organizations to go to multiple suppliers and say, hey, you have an opportunity to be a partner with us, and we may order from you, we may not order from you, but you're responsible for this widget, and here's an initial order of whatever your MOQ is. Here's the money. Let's go and let's see what you got, and we'll work with you as a partnership to really help you make sure you get it right, and then be on call for whatever reason whenever we need you, right? So that's I would say that's normal practice. I think coming out of this pandemic, hopefully coming out of this pandemic, a lot of organizations have shifted to this, and what I'm also seeing is smaller organizations starting to think this way, to me, is really exciting, right? So emerging up and coming organizations that manufacture either food and beverage or fast moving consumer goods, they're thinking long term and having strategies in place to essentially support growth or slow down growth within their supply chain network, which is exciting to me, because only large organizations or the Fortune 500 or Fortune X organizations, they shouldn't be the only ones having the luxury of planning like this. I think any organization, no matter how big or small you are, should be thinking in this way, right? Because what's going to set you apart what's going to set you apart from the competition is your ability to react on a dime with your supply chain, and then ultimately deliver your goods and services to your customers, because that's what's going to give you that competitive edge. So if Jeff, you and I had the same widget but 2 different companies, you had a better supply chain and sourcing and supplier strategy than I did, even though we may be leveraging the same supplier for 1 or 2 of our parts. If you have a more diversified supplier strategy, you're going to beat me, right? Because if I got all my eggs in one basket or a couple of baskets, you're going to take my customers away, right? At the end of the day, especially for fast moving consumer goods, brand loyalty and all of that stuff kind of goes out the window in my mind when it comes to, I need this now, right? I need a plastic cup now. I don't care if it's whatever it is, it's just a plastic. So that I think is going to trump and give the competitive edge.
I agree. Well, I think that kind of wraps it up in terms of our perspective on the Deloitte study, flash survey regarding procurement strategy amid a pandemic.